We're going to continue our exploration of feudalism and life in the early Middle Ages by looking at the role of the church. All right, let's get started by looking at the scope and authority of the church. First of all, it held spiritual power and some political power as well. So we know that, again, the Pope is a spokesperson for God on earth, according to Roman Catholics, but he also was the leader of the Papal States. So again, he had spiritual power, religious power, but also political power as well. He also had the right to sanctify or pick a monarch. And what that meant was it was the Pope's ability to basically declare who could be king or who could be emperor. We saw that earlier when we talked about the role of Charlemagne and his need for the Pope to sanctify him as divinely chosen by God. We also want to take a look at religion as a unifying force. They were shared beliefs and teaching that bound people together. All right, so sometimes the role of the church is portrayed negatively in the Middle Ages, but we have to keep in mind that this was something that people truly believed in, and it brought them closer together. It gave them a sense of identity. And it was also a stable force. The church was the only remaining institution that had survived from the old ancient Roman Empire. So as a stable force, it provided a sense of security and community for people as well. Just like churches do today. Many people go to church today because they like a sense of community that they get from being there with people that share the same type of beliefs and values. And so the church played that role in the Middle Ages as well. Now, the church structure, there were many different ranks of clergy. Obviously, there was the Pope at the top, and then it would be followed by cardinals, and then the bishops, and then there would be priests. But keep in mind that even within that church social structure, we could draw it like a traditional social structure pyramid, but the Pope, cardinals, and bishops were really at the top half of that chart. Most of the power lay with them. But many of the monks and priests basically spent most of their time with common people and were more traditionally less powerful than, say, the elites at the top, the popes, the cardinals, and the bishops. So even within the church, there were two different sort of social statuses that came along with being a member of the church. There was also church justice. To start, we had canon law, which basically dealt with marriage and religious practices. So the church had its laws about how you got married, who you could marry, also what the religious practices were. You had to strictly adhere to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And if you did not, then you could suffer what was called excommunication. And to be excommunicated essentially meant to be kicked out of the church. And if you're kicked out of the church, then you'd have denial of salvation. You wouldn't be able to be saved. You wouldn't be able to get into heaven. So keep this in mind. Although people may not be as strict as they once were about their religious beliefs, in the Middle Ages, people took both canon law and the concept of excommunication very seriously. To be kicked out of the church would mean you would never ever get into heaven. And people honestly believed that that would be really an awful thing to have happen to them. So people basically obeyed church justice, the laws of the church, so that they could be saved. Now, the church was also the center of learning. So monks and nuns tended to be better educated than the common people, particularly monks. And as we've seen under Charlemagne, they had been responsible for setting up universities and schools, but also for reading, writing, and copying texts as well. And so what we know is that they preserved the writings of the ancient world, particularly the Greek, Roman, and the Byzantine classics, and even Arabic texts as well. So the church's role as a center of learning was also to acquire knowledge, information, copy those books, preserve that knowledge for the future, but they also limited access to it. Now, although this is just a sort of cartoon drawing that I've come across, I want you to pay attention to something in the picture that's interesting. If you notice, on the shelves where the books are, they showed chains. And it's interesting that there would be chains here because the chains illustrate the fact that they would copy texts, but they were not readily available to common people. In fact, common people were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Only church officials could read and write. And by having the books locked away, literally under chain, lock and chain, basically ensured that the church had knowledge and information and not any other institution or other people. This contributed to making the church a very powerful institution during the Middle Ages. All of this would be challenged by the time we get to the late Middle Ages, going into the Renaissance, with the inventing of the printing press. When the printing press is invented, all of a sudden books will be more widely available, people will start to learn how to read, The books will be published in vernacular languages, meaning everyday languages like German, and all of a sudden they'll be able to read for themselves.